Good morning, Fellowship Hi-Crest. Thank you for joining us today for our Jumpstart. Today we'll be in Esther, chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, and then we will jump down to chapter 9 and look at verses 20 through 23. Go ahead and join me as we're reading today. It says, "So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, 'Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you even if it is half the kingdom.' Queen Esther replied, 'If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, annihilate us. If we had been merely sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, but for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king.' 'Who would do such a thing?' King Xerxes demanded. 'Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?' Esther replied, 'The wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy.' Haman grew pale with fright before the king and the queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, 'Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?' As soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, 'Haman has set a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale Haman on it,' the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided." Then chapter 9, verses 20 through 23. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all of the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival of these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness, and by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. All right. Just some observations, I see continued throughout the story of Esther, this tension between are God's people going to survive this threat, and is God going to come through on his promise to always save his people? And that's just this tension that's in the story. And so we see here by the end, yes, God keeps his promises to his people. This is a story of life and death, and where life is granted to God's people. We see the same thing happen in the New Testament with Jesus. God extends the promise of life to each person that chooses to follow him and be a part of God's family. It says in John 14:19, "Soon the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Since I live, you also live." Through this whole story, with the tension of, will God's people survive? Will God keep his promises? We see that God does come through, and the truth is God's promises always stand. The same is true for us as believers today. And so my question for us is, how does that fuel our confidence during our day-to-day lives? Do we continue to live in confidence of our own abilities, or rest in the promises of God? My challenge for us today is to look at the areas in our life that we may be depending on our own abilities, or are we resting in God's promises in those areas? So thanks for joining us today. Continue to power up, pour in, and spill out.